scholars working across a range of many fields and periods in the U.S. and beyond. But again, in this book, the focus was on ideas, the ideas that enlivened social policy on both sides of the Atlantic, and again prompted rethinking of a field of history, in this case, reform. In Age of Fracture, as we'll soon hear, Professor Rodgers explores the ideas that emerged from and helped shape the last quarter of the 20th century. Perhaps more than any of his previous books, this is a work of intellectual history in its purest form. But once again, Dan refuses to separate ideas from our political or social lives, and instead reveals how they both arose from and informed the experience of Americans at every turn. When we look at this book within the context of his entire oeuvre, it becomes clear that over the past 4 decades, Daniel Rodgers has been remaking the craft of intellectual history, and in so doing has demonstrated why it must be considered an essential part of the historical discipline in the 21st century. Dan began working on the Age of Fracture as a fellow at the Wilson Center in 1999-2000, and while he was here, he got to know John Judis, who is one of today's commentators. A public intellectual, John has, since 1984, worked at the New Republic, a journal that is one of the sites of political intellectual ferment that Dan discusses in his book. Like Dan's, John's career might be read as a kind of palimpsest of late 20th century intellectual life. A founding editor of the New Left newspaper in these times, John has been a contributing editor at GQ and also written for the American Prospect. In addition to his innumerable articles and columns, he has published 5 books, which are listed in the biography sheet that you have. His work often combines incisive analysis of contemporary politics with observations drawn from history. In his most recent book, The Folly of Empire, published in 2004, for example, Judis criticizes George W. Bush for failing to heed the lessons that Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson had learned from their experience with empire, namely, as Wilson put it, that self-government is not a thing that can be given to any people. Our second commentator, Michael Kimmage, also studies the intersection of ideas and politics in American history, and he teaches about these subjects at Catholic University, where he's an associate professor. His recent book, The Conservative Turn, Lionel Trilling, Whittaker Chambers, and the Lessons of Anti-Communism, traces the often dizzying political zigzags of those two important figures in the period just preceding the Age of Fracture. Reviewer Damon Linker, writing in the New Republic, that seemingly indispensable journal, called Kimmage a perceptive and insightful guide through this territory, deftly weaving the ideas of his protagonists together with the story of their lives and the history of their country over nearly half a century. In posing key questions about the nature of American conservative, Linker writes, Michael Kimmage has done more than produce an important work of scholarship. He has contributed to our civic self-understanding. So we are obviously very fortunate to have these 3 fine scholars and thinkers with us today to discuss Daniel Rodgers' new book, Age of Fracture. Dan will start us off by introducing the book and some of its major themes for about half an hour. John and Michael will then each have 15 minutes for their comments, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Afterwards, please join us for wine and cheese, during which time copies of the book will be available for sale and signing. Daniel Rodgers, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that very generous introduction. Thanks actually for taking me in last night as I came trying to stay one meter ahead of the storm down from New York, and thanks to the Wilson Center for making this occasion possible. It's a terrific pleasure to be back here in a time warp, since the building has not changed one iota in 10 years. But it was the place where, just across the way here, this book began, in conversations with Michael Lacey, who was Sonia's predecessor at that time, with conversations with my fellows at the Wilson Center, and with some conversations with John as well, which I remember very, very fondly. Of course, it was a different book then. One's plans are never exactly what comes out, because you don't just, at least in my experience, you just don't write books. They pull at you. They resist you. They take you in places that you did not expect to go. They pose puzzles that you did not understand at the outset. They write you and you write them, and that process I think all of us know, and ultimately one learns to respect. So the puzzle I began with is related to, but not quite the puzzle I ended up trying to think about in Age of Fracture. The puzzle I began with was one that all persons who cared about ideas, not just intellectual historians, but anyone who cared about social ideas in the 20th century was puzzled by, which was, why it was that sometime in the 1980s, arguments seemed to shift. Ideas and assumptions across the board of social thought seemed somehow to be moving in directions that one might not have predicted. Old mantras came back. Economic notions that one hadn't heard in 100 years suddenly became part and parcel of the way in which one talked about social life. There was a watershed of sorts in the 1980s, one of those places where, as Stuart Hall writes, one senses breaks, where old lines of thought are disrupted and regrouped around a different set of premises and themes. And so I wanted to puzzle that through. I wasn't looking for a zeitgeist. I wasn't looking for a new spirit of the age. America, I say to my students, I say to myself, we must say to each other over and over again, America is an argument. It's a big, multitudinous, multi-sided, continuous argument. It has no mind. It has no spirit of the age. But one could look, I thought, one could look at some of the era's key debates. One could look at the way those debates were framed and how those frames shifted, how certain kinds of things fell out of what it was possible to think about seriously, and therefore out of what was possible to do seriously. One could think about the fault lines down which American society began to splinter and how those shifted. And one could think about the big books with traction in this period and what might have given them their traction and what we might want to make about that. Framing of arguments. Framing of arguments, we all say this now. It matters how we think about selves and society, not just the content, but the ways in which they are bounded, because everything turns on that. Change those frames, and politics itself is transformed. The limits of what is possible are recast. Change those intellectual foundations, and everything is destabilized, and everything comes up for grabs. And if this is I've not thought of myself as a crusader, if this is the as it were, the motive of, it seems to me, not only my work, but much of the very best work of the last generation of historians, it has been to take these things seriously. And that was also what the aides at the Reagan White House meant when they quoted that Richard Weaver line that ideas have consequences, and said to themselves over and over again, ideas have consequences. And it's what they meant by telling themselves that they were engaged in a war of ideas. A battle not just about this or that policy or this and that piece of the tax code, but about changing the very images in our heads of society and selves and government. Well, that's where I started, and it wasn't a bad starting place to think about American society and culture and politics in the late 20th century. But the Reagan White House was not the right starting point either, I quickly began to realize. It's been an awful lot of work on the presidency and the powers of the presidency in the last in the 20th century. Much of that work is extremely good, and folks write important books about the age of Reagan or the age of Clinton or the Bush years or whatever. But I think it misreads. It misreads how much ability even the most powerful and persuasive of presidents have to act on their own, outside the structures of politics, societies, and ideas that they already work within. The opening chapter of Age of Fracture is on Ronald Reagan, how the rhetoric of the Cold War, in fact, fell out of his speeches, much against the conventional reading, but I think it's quite accurate, how he lost the words for the Cold War. But Reagan, I realized, could not be the center of the story that I wanted to tell. Nor could the 1980s, actually. That convention that we all share, journalists and historians, we're all complicit in this, that something serious happens every time that decadal odometer turns over and all those O's appear, it's a crutch. It's an illusion. Decades are rarely the right container for history. If we're going to hunt for that moment of break, as Stuart Hall puts it, when old lines of thoughts were disrupted and new ones began, it seems to me we're going to have to think about the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, as ending with a much longer period. An era that began in the early 1970s, in the economic and global crises of the early 1970s, and stretches right into our own current moment. This is the post-Fordist age, David Harvey calls it. And what he means by that, as I think you know, the end of the high-wage, manufacturing-based economy, the end of an economy that still had a significant proportion of unionized enterprises within it, the end of 30 years of steady economic growth, 30 years of steadily lessening income inequalities, eras of big economic and political ambitions. That characterizes, I think we now realize, the period from 1945 up until sometime in the 1970s. And then I think, as we all know, things shift quite dramatically. In the stagflation crisis, the oil crisis, the economic doldrums of the 1970s, one sees ushered in retrospect, an age of much fiercer global competition, a much more uncertain and volatile economy, much more aggressive finance capitalism, much more and steadily growing inequality. Not a new age of conservative consensus, but an age of divided and highly volatile politics. That's the context, I think, in which one sees emerging in the last quarter of the 20th century and which still envelops us. But whipsawed as this period has been, and still continues to be right at this very moment, by material and economic change, it was also awash in ideas and arguments. It was an era of books, big, seriously intended books with unexpectedly big audiences. Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind, for example, but also Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and many others that you could add to the list as well as I. It was a period of dramatic change in many of the academic disciplines. It was a period of new transmission systems to get ideas more quickly into the public sphere. It was an era marked by struggle not just over policies, but by the very intellectual foundations of society and governance. And in addition, if all of this intellectual ferment, intellectual contest, had the seriousness of war, it was not one in which the two sides stayed stable. In fact, it was not polarized as neatly as that at all. But it was a period in which arguments slipped back and forth between the political blocs, which both the left and the right were remade. We know the pieces of this argument, but let me remind you of just a couple of them. Deregulation of public utilities was a radical project long before it was a conservative project. The first practical school voucher proposals were the work of liberal social scientists, not of conservatives. Libertarian ideas fissured through both the political right and the political left. So what I've tried to do in Age of Fracture is not repeat the partisan arguments of the time, to try to pull us back from some of the ways in which they have simplified our own age, and to think more broadly about ideas and arguments in this era across politics and policy, but also about changes in economic ideas, changing conceptions of society and power, about critically important shifts in race and gender, and in concepts of history and time, and to ask how they reshaped what was possible, normal, natural, and to do so from university thought on the one level to the grounds of politics and social movements on the other. And yet, across this large canvas, within this cacophony and diversity, there was, I think, a recurrent thread, and that's what I've also tried to do and bring out in this project. And I call that thread the fracturing of the strong readings of society that had dominated most of the century. That's a very abstract way to put it, obviously. But if there was one critically important intellectual production of the first two-thirds of the 20th century, if there was one intellectual production that undergirded modern social and political thought, it was the importance of society. Society shaping power over the individual, socialized within it, was one of the things one took for granted throughout most of the 20th century. Society had its collective imperatives. One thought about, one cared to think about the way in which its interdependent relationships joined individuals together in webs of common consequence. Conservative intellectuals took the presence and the pressure of society seriously, and so did left and liberal ones. But by the end of the 20th century, social thought on both the left and the right had broken into fragments. The new keywords I suggest we're no longer structure, interdependence, socialization, institutions, power. In their place had come a new vocabulary of agency, contingency, choice. The point is not just that social life was fragmented. Social life is fragmented. But social life has been fragmented for a long time in American society. The more important, I think, is that the very idea of the social, of the public, of structures, fissured into smaller, individual micro pieces. I've tried to map that in the book to talk about how these shifts happen over different terrains. I mean, I can only give you a tiny little flavor of it here, but let me just point to three, as it were, regions on this map of social thought in our most recent past. One was the remaking of economic theory in the crisis years of the 1970s. We know those years as years of economic upheaval. We know those as the years of extremely high inflation. We know, and at times, a very high unemployment. We know those as very, very difficult years in material and consequential ways on human lives, not only in the United States, but across the globe. But they were not only the years of a crisis in economic behavior, they were years of a crisis in economic thought, which had enormous consequences for the world in which we now live. Because those were the years when the macroeconomic models fell apart. Keynesianism, most consequently, fractured not so much as a set of particular policies. People still will trot out Keynesian arguments for tax cuts, for example, on both the right and the left, but as a coherent understanding of the way in which the economy and society worked, pitched in terms of economic and social aggregates, measurable by certain kinds of aggregate data. When Keynesian models failed to predict what was going to happen in the 1970s, and they failed quite spectacularly, the rest of the structure began to totter and ultimately to come close to falling apart. The great alternative, monetarism, Milton Friedman's alternative to Keynesianism, which many of you remember, didn't do any better. And it fell apart even more quickly, even more spectacularly between 1979 and 1985. None of the economists could predict. And since macroeconomists had tied their whole science to their ability to predict, the macro end of economics, which had been the high prestige end of economics, went through turmoil and crisis in these years. But out of it came not a new macroeconomics. Out of it came the turn in economic thought which still defines economics in our day, which is away from starting with aggregates, starting with macro structures, starting with business cycles, and toward micro models. Models that you can almost hold, if they're good, in the palm of your hand, in which rational, market-savvy actors were at their center. The field of the social was reconceptualized in the new economics as a field of costs and incentives. And the prestige for self-regulated individual action, the work of the market, rose to a level that hadn't been so seen in a century. All economics is micro. Peggy Noonan heard the word even at the Reagan White House. The textbooks, which had begun with macroeconomics from the 1940s on, suddenly turned the formula around and put micro first. Structures gave way to questions of individual action. Questions of public goods, public spending, gave way to a world that conceptually began with individual, choice-making actors. So that's one terrain, which I've passed through more quickly than I should, but it had enormous consequences for the social sciences and for our world of politics and policy. Second terrain was what we might call the evaporation of the idea of power, at least power as intellectuals earlier in the 20th century had understood it. Economists had always had a somewhat ambivalent relationship with power, but in mid-20th century social science, power mattered, institutional power. Who gets what, when, how? That was the question that social scientists asked, and their answers pointed to interest groups, to institutions, And it could be a clunky way of thinking about power, but it had a force still into the 1960s and early 1970s. Maybe it was that clunkiness. Maybe it was shifts in the media. Maybe it was generational shifts. Maybe it was, in fact, the new experience of living within a more complicated world of signs and symbols. But historians found themselves, and other social scientists, drawn away from things as clunky as interest groups. And they began to think about subtler sorts of power. Power that lay in discourse, the power that lay in language, the power that lay in symbols. But as they followed Clifford Geertz and Gramsci and others around what was called the linguistic turn, they not only brought a critically important dimension of culture into focus, but they let almost all talk of structures, class, capitalism, mass society, whatever, quietly slip out of the center of debate. Power, it began to be said, was found in the interstices and its subtle and pervasive micro-presences. That was where Michel Foucault argued power couldn't be disentangled from resistance. Power was everywhere, and yet nowhere quite graspable. And in the books of futurology, which mushroomed in this period, from Alvin Toffler to Thomas Friedman of our own day, power simply evaporated altogether. Pyramids were shrinking. Consumer responsive markets operated as a perpetual referendum machine. Choice was everywhere. The world was flat. Which was, we know, not far from the set of assumptions that some of the very best and brightest and best trained of the economists brought to the world of the post-communist order after 1989, with the assumption that they could, whatever the pre-existing set of institutions, whatever the pre-existing structures of habit might be, turn those societies overnight in shock therapy, through shock therapy, in one big bang into a capitalist order. So I try in this book to think about economic ideas, how the word market suddenly got some of its magic power. I try to think about the ways in which thoughts about change and power shifted. And I've also tried to think about what happened at the ground of social movements as well, because something related occurs there too, I think. A fragmentation that we've not totally got right, I think, yet. The fragmentation did not happen quickly and did not happen overnight. The labor movement still had enough power in the 1980s to persuade the Democratic Party to endorse a program of industrial policy. And black consciousness was not only present in the Jesse Jackson campaigns of the 1980s, but in mayoral races across the country. And the women's movement, sense of high confidence, was still, though somewhat under stress, still palpable when the 1980s began. In fact, the continued power of feminism to disrupt and destabilize gender conventions is, it seems to me, at the root of what the journalists began to call the culture wars at the very end of the 1980s. Those culture wars were about all kinds of things. As you know, they were about biblical faith, and they were about Cold War policy, and they were about abortion. But they were also about new understandings, new concern with gender and its stabilization and destabilization. New groups grabbed the microphones, they came to the fore, but at the front of many of those arguments was a question about gender certainty and gender slippage. So I don't want to dismiss the importance of the identity movements in this period. But the categories around which social movements had claimed their identity and authenticity shifted. They broke into smaller and more volatile pieces. Race, for example. In the 1940s, to be a race man was a label of pride. In black Chicago, one spoke for the race. One knew what that word meant, as much as context could spin around it. Black power in the 1960s and early 1970s was a word you might contest, but everybody knew what it meant. But by the very end of the 80s, the language of race was starting to grow unstable, and intellectuals like Henry Louis Gates began to put it in quotation marks. Quotation marks to show that it was an artificial construct. It was all in the heads and the prejudices of the human actors. It was not in biology. But the question marks meant more than that. They stood for a struggle over whether categories of race really were as clear, as stable as they had seemed before. This was the point that feminists were making, that all identities, in fact, intersected with other identities, and none of them could hold the whole person. Identities were multiple, intersectional, plural, not singular. Even woman. Feminists began to write in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that the woman that had seemed so clear, so powerful, so important of a category, that sense of we that was critical to early feminism, that began to seem restrictive, essentializing. What we heard now was that identities were fluctuating, they were multiple, they were fragmented, they were decentered, they were shifting, they were self-contradictory, they were a patchwork, they were a performance. Identities were strategic. They were to some extent elective. They too, in a way, were a field of choice. And even on the conservative side of identity politics, where nothing mattered more than trying to keep everything stable, trying to keep truth as it must be, even there, the social movements rose and fell with extraordinary speed as churches and preachers mushroomed, fell apart, as seekers for truth and certainty shopped for venues, and those venues breaking apart shopped again. Not every part of the older vocabulary, those older keywords that Americans lived by, not every part fragmented. There were, in some terrains of American society, strong appeals to community, to collective bonds, to solidarity, though they were often pitched in somewhat more partial and gated terms than, say, the 1950s. And the disaggregation of the social imagination on micro-pieces, that convergence on choice, had its angry reactions. And finally, it was not all loss. Identities by the end of the period were much less tightly caged than they had been at the beginning. There were more choices. There were more openly possible ways of being a person than there were before, and the forces of conformity were weaker. Age of Fracture is not a book, I hope, written in nostalgia. History of arguments about our own time and arguments in our own time written in nostalgia is not going to get us of any serious, be of any serious utility to us. Ideas of the social can be too strong, and they can tyrannize. And yet, without a stronger sense of society, without a stronger sense of the webs of interdependence and the mutual entanglement of our lives and of the public good, we lose any serious connection with the world in which we live. So this is the kind of map I have made. I'm just about the end here, and I'm very interested to hear what John and Michael, and then you will say in response. I've tried to make, as it were, a map, a set of braided stories about how things changed over this period. The book ends with 9/11, at a moment when observers thought another break had occurred in that whirlwind of collective patriotism, which had both its heroic and its ugly faces, in that sea of flags and that new rhetoric of common fates. Those possibilities, too, swirled within these, across this terrain, and they are still present, though they dissipated quite quickly, as we all remember after 9/11. The election of 2008 might have been another moment. Historians of the Obama administration are going to struggle to understand how a presidential candidate who mobilized crowds on a rock star level, whose very stories seem to assert the possibilities of a radical break with the past, how he has found it so difficult to put his mark on the political culture of his day, how his yes we can, how that slipped away. And we'll find our answers in politics, and we'll find our answers in the history of the media, and we'll find our answers in the resurgent conservative movement, and we'll find our answers in the arcana of congressional maneuver, and we'll find our answers in the massive economic crisis that was thrust upon him and upon us. But presidents work within the stock of terms and arguments at their disposal. And Obama struggled to find resonant words and powerful traction for the collective good, for the interdependence of lives and fortunes, for the work of government and democratic choice, for the mutually connected worlds of public and private responsibility. His struggle to find words for the social, to put something tangible on that term we. That is shaped by the age of fracture that we helped to make and that he and we have inherited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. John?
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to have the chance to comment on Dan's work. I should mention, before I met him, I met Contested Truths, which is his second book, and which I recommend to all of you as sort of a counterweight or an antidote to the kind of fashionable French analysis of political language that you'll find discussed in his book. I think it's a terrific book about American history. I want to talk here today sort of about the macro picture. What Dan does in his book is to sketch out brilliantly how the details of our language and the details of how we see our nation, ourselves, changed from 1970, say, to 2010. And I want to try to frame that some in the broad sweep of history, at the risk of just providing some BS. But let's see if I can do it in a way that will illuminate the discussion. If you break out the changes that Dan is describing from the period after World War II, from let's say 1945 to 1960 being the kind of the height of it, and then the next period starts in mid-70s to the present, it's a change from, on the one hand, a period of nationalism, social solidarity, communitarianism, respect for institutions, including government, to a period of individualism, fragmentation, as he described, disrespect for or skepticism about institutions, most particularly government. Now, the first thing I want to suggest about this is that that's not new to American history, but it's a recurring pattern that's happened throughout our history. If you look at our history, we've had different periods of, let me shortcut it and say national solidarity, the Civil War, especially if you look at the North, and the period after it. For a brief time, World War I, the Depression, and then the Cold War period up to the early 60s. These were periods when again, we had a sense of ourselves embodied really in John Kennedy's inaugural address, which Dan cites and contrasts with the way that Reagan talked about nation and about our common purpose. Those periods have been the exception, I think. The default has been the kind of thing that, in general, Dan is describing starts in the mid-70s and goes up through the present. I think there's a lot of similarity, for instance, between the 1920s and the 1990s, to give one example, especially in terms of the spirit of individualism that was prevalent then. So what we're looking at, again, is a pattern, is a cycle in American history where really our default, what we start with, is skepticism about nation, about national institutions, a kind of, again, anti-statism, which is very familiar now, and more individualism than communitarianism. Now, what distinguishes the periods of nationalism and social solidarity is that those are the periods where we feel some foreign threat, or the periods where we feel some threat from within, as we did during the Depression. The Depression was an archetypical period of communitarianism, and many of you here probably know Warren Sussman's work on that, and I think that's exactly what he brings out. September 11th could have been that kind of period again, but it didn't last long enough. It didn't have the kind of enduring impact If it had gone on, and I'll get to this in a moment, if we had had to have the kind of national mobilization that we had in the Cold War or World War II, then I think you would have seen a change. As it was very passing and fleeting. Now, what happened after World War II? You might think that what ended and what changed the period from nationalism to individualism was the end of the Cold War. But as Dan shows, it starts much earlier. It starts in the 1970s. And I'd say there's two things that interrelated account for that. The first is Vietnam. Vietnam is very important because it undermines the national purpose for many people for which we were fighting the Cold War. We believed we were spreading democracy overseas. We believed that it was a struggle between liberty and tyranny. And for many of the young people at the time, it seemed to belie that. And it undermined that. And it ended that. It undermined that sense of national purpose. So it's beginning in the Vietnam War that you began from the protesters, America written with a K, people refusing to stand up for the Star-Spangled Banner at sports events, and so on. The second thing that happens then that's extremely important is the end of the draft in the end of the first term of Richard Nixon. The draft, as you know, you could see from countries in Europe, from Israel, is extraordinarily important for building a spirit of national solidarity. The end of it meant, in effect, that the people fighting for the country were they, and as Dan cites later when he's talking about the world after September 11th, we were always being grateful for their sacrifice. I myself always wanted, I always thought we should have a draft, even though, again, I was a draft resistor myself, precisely because it's such an important foundation of our foreign policy. If we'd had a draft, I very much doubt we would have gotten into something like the Iraq War. But that era is gone, and I think we can't bring it back. And what Dan describes are conditions which do make it impossible and inconceivable. I was at an event of Democrats after about a year after September 11th, where they were trying to figure out the strategy for what to do. And Theda Skocpol, who was a big advocate of this kind of communitarian approach, and the other people there were saying, well, what we have to do is national service, and we have to get everybody feeling that we have this communal sense of communal obligation to each other. And there was a young woman who was an intern, who wasn't a big shot there, but who was helping with the presentation. And she was a student at the University of Maryland. And she said, well, can I say something? And she said, well, I think it's a good idea maybe, but nobody I know in school would go along with that idea that they had to go into the Army or national service or things. It just... again, it was a dash of cold water, and you realize that the era is gone, and what we're in is something like the era that Dan describes. The last thing I want to say is something that's kind of tangential to Dan's analysis, but I think it's relevant because, especially in terms of what he touches on when he talks about the market and economics. There's a way in which our own era is not part of a cycle, but it's a part of a peculiar juncture or a peculiar kind of crisis. We seem to have always had in America, and people here are going to come up with exceptions, I'm sure, and teach me that I'm speaking too broadly, an idea of our future and what the future should bring, and how what we're doing now will lead to a better future. A kind of utopianism, if you like, but again, a utopianism that guided us. Socialism, social democracy was very important to the New Deal. It provided, on the one hand, you could say Stalinism, all that stuff, but it was also the foundation of a lot of the ideas of New Deal liberalism, the social welfare state. That was the end towards which we were moving. In the early 60s, you go beyond that, and you get this kind of utopian view expressed in books like The Greening of America, Robert Theobald's books. There was a thing called the Triple Revolution, that we were entering this period of enormous productivity where the labor hours that people were going to have to work would be very diminished. You could have guaranteed annual income, everything like this, and it was an era. Abundance was the key word. And that dream, that idea of where we were heading as a nation, and those possibilities were undermined in the 70s by the energy crisis and by stagflation. And what we got instead is what Dan describes in his book, the myth of the dream of the market, that somehow through the reinvigoration of private enterprise, of entrepreneurialism, we could build a country that would fulfill all these dreams of prosperity, freedom, and so on, without having to have a strong state, industrial policy, and so on. And there very much is, I think, if historians are going to say, and I think, and this is certainly in Dan's book, that there's a complete continuity between the Reagan and Clinton eras in that respect. I mean, you can call Reagan sort of the right wing of market fundamentalism, and Clinton the left wing. He wanted to do it. You know, it was going to be the globalization plus the market in the United States with a safety net underneath to help people, and he was very good about that. But it was still underlying. It was the same kind of mythology, the same kind of idea that we could do it that way. That idea has been destroyed by the current recession, depression, the financial collapse. And we're in a very kind of strange period in America. On the one hand, there's all these nuts on the right who really want to go back even further than the market ideas that Reagan or the economists of the 70s had, to a kind of dreamy world of the 19th century. Where we have a kind of constitutional government or what have you. But there's not really anything that's replaced that. There's not a positive vision of the future. And I think, again, when you come back to where Dan ended on the Obama and Yes We Can, what we're seeing now is that the difficulty that the president and the present administration has had in putting forward a framework of the future that would bind our country, that would give us an idea of the common good, and that would relate what the government's doing to that future. And I think that that's a big problem that we're having right now as a country. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
First of all, thank you to Sonia for the invitation, for the kind introduction. It's very much an honor to be here, and in light of that honor, I'm going to read from prepared comments and not from notes. So excuse the possible stiffness of that approach. A common enough intellectual paradox of the 1930s involved two principles. One was political. The best available idea was socialism, a comprehensive system of social organization. And the other principle was literary. The best literary movement was modernism, a movement connected to a constellation of names, to Joyce, Proust, T.S. Eliot, John Dos Passos, etc. The appeal of socialism followed from the Great Depression, from a faith in reason, and from a certain optimism about the powers of government. Government could check the illogic and selfishness of big business, the very forces that had created the Depression. The appeal of modernism flowed from the literature itself, in part from the grandeur of the writing, but it was also interwoven with a distinctive mood, a despair about modern life, a sense that the traditional certainties, connections, and communities had broken down, a terror in the face of reason, and of government thickly associated with the name of Franz Kafka, a prince among the modernists. Gradually the paradox grew clearer. One need not follow T.S. Eliot all the way to monarchism, or Ezra Pound all the way to fascism, yet listening closely to their music unsettled an easy faith in socialism. Socialism, a child of the French Revolution, promised liberation. Modernist literature demonstrated all the ways in which modern man was caught, trapped in oppression, as were so many Kafka protagonists, or trapped in the noise and blur of modern America, as were the characters in John Dos Passos' novel cycle, USA. Age of Fracture Professor Rodgers' extraordinary new book on the social thought of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s chronicles a much later chapter in American intellectual history. Yet the paradox of the 1930s did not entirely vanish in the final decades of the 20th century. In fact, its key questions on the nature of modern life and on the ideal form of political organization remained intact. They were merely turned inside out. Socialism had faded away, having been replaced by a rampant affection for capitalism, or for the market in the parlance of the era. And the disaggregation heralded by modern literature had changed from a tragic cause for despair to a proactive intellectual project, visible on both the left and right sides of the American political spectrum. Thought imitated life, and life imitated thought. Quote, the disaggregation of the social that was being played out among the public philosophers, Rodgers writes, helped to frame the terms of politics. End quote. Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush each played their part in what was originally an intellectual drama. Each president thinned out the social commitments, the idea of society, the will to build lasting institutions that had marked mid-century American politics. What fascinates Professor Rodgers, I suspect, and this is confirmed by his opening remarks, is not the phenomenon of fracturing, which can be found in all historical eras, but the conscious, considered, and enthusiastic embrace of fractures, of downsizing, of microeconomics, of individualism, of gender trouble, of ethnic and racial hybridity, and of impermanence itself, an embrace peculiar to the period Professor Rodgers is analyzing. In 1967, Robert Wiebe published The Search for Order about the era between 1877 and 1920. Here, Professor Rodgers has given us a book on the philosophical flight from order. In my comments, I'll identify the major contribution of this book, in my view, and then I will pose two critical questions about its argument. The book's title mirrors that of Professor Rodgers' Princeton colleague Sean Wilentz, who has written a political history of the same period. Wilentz calls his book The Age of Reagan, which echoes the title of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s three-volume study, The Age of Roosevelt. To my mind, the single most important quality in Age of Fracture starts with the missing article. The Age of Reagan and The Age of Roosevelt are more definitive, more unidirectional, and more blandly political than Age of Fracture, which belongs to no single president. In the body of Rodgers' book, Reagan's enemies coexist with the president. Put differently, critics of Reagan share certain attributes of a presidency that they openly deplored. In this historical world, nothing happens in isolation. No clinical separation is made between left and right, liberal and conservative. No simple pendulum swings from party to party. Instead, politics is a perpetual battle for meaning in ways anticipated by one of Professor Rodgers' earlier books, Contested Truths, Keywords in American Politics Since Independence, published, one is compelled to observe, at the end of the Reagan presidency in 1987. It is precisely this contest for truth that gives shape and texture to a historical era. No historian of the United States pays closer attention to words than Professor Rodgers, and the insight yielded is astonishing. Liberals and conservatives organized their thoughts and formed their imagination on a thinning notion of the social, starting in the 1970s and culminating in the Iraq War of 2003. As they did so, their awareness of the other was crucial. Within and between left and right, quote, the emergent talk of fluidity and choice grew in tandem with contrary desires for centers and certainties, each drawing on the other's energy, end quote. This insight is the foundation for Professor Rodgers' boldly synthetic history. He has not only written one of the first intellectual histories of the period, he has written the first history to connect Reagan's speeches with critical legal theory, with post-structuralism in the academy, with the rise of market ideology, with the loss of a historical sensibility, and with the September 11th attacks. For a book about fracture and disaggregation, Professor Rodgers has done a remarkable job of aggregating disparate areas of American intellectual culture, and of finding the leitmotif common to all of them, exploiting the gentle oxymoron implicit to his title. My first critical question is about Ronald Reagan. Professor Rodgers contends that Ronald Reagan, quote, lost the words for the Cold War, end quote. What he means by this is that a therapeutic optimism crowded out the language of duty, struggle, and sacrifice taken for granted in the early decades of the Cold War. Reagan's privatization, even of martial virtue, would be replicated by George W. Bush in response to September 11th. One could dream one's way to victory, and history's movable timeline was bound to serve the American national interest. This is a brilliant reading of political speeches from Reagan to W. Bush, and it beautifully frames Age of Fracture. But it is also, I think, a foreshortened interpretation of the Reagan presidency. In popular memory, if one is to judge from Reagan's recent funeral, Reagan is celebrated for winning the Cold War. More broadly, Reagan is remembered as a genial advocate of American nationhood. When Barack Obama expressed guarded appreciation for Reagan in his campaign for the presidency, it was this quality that Obama appreciated. Reagan's post-Vietnam nationalism points to a difference between left and right that Professor Rodgers acknowledges at times and obscures at other times. For example, Professor Rodgers aligns the thinning of the social with, quote, the retreat from nationalism, end quote, implying that this is a bipartisan reality. In their infatuation with the market, conservatives lost sight of Edmund Burke, of tradition, and of history deeply understood. They could speak of a common culture, quote, but the pressure of their own imagination ran toward disaggregation, end quote. What is true of economics is not necessarily true of politics generally, and Reagan's presidency cannot be construed as a retreat from nationalism. In the wake of the Vietnam War and of the New Left, the American left struggled painfully with nationalism. Richard Rorty addressed this struggle in his 1998 book, Achieving Our Country, a book that, because of its nationalist spirit, was coldly received on the left. Reagan, meanwhile, had an accessible language of nationalism at his disposal, and neoconservative intellectuals such as Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, Gertrude Himmelfarb, David Brooks, William Kristol did what they could to articulate an ideology of American nationalism, less in the sphere of political economy than of international relations. And the tangible institution at the heart of this project was the U.S. military. Can one thus write a history of American nationalism from Reagan to George W. Bush, from the end phase of the Cold War to the Iraq War, a history that militates against the motif of fracture? If so, does fracture deserve its status as the era's dominant motif? Second question. I want to ask a question about causality. In no simple sense do ideas cause political change. And here I have, of course, Age of Fracture in mind. At the same time in this book, ideas are not epiphenomenal, nor do they chase after some more important social and political process. Indeed, they are part of the process. A premise of the book is that political change can originate in words and in the shared imagination of a culture. I could identify 4 larger shifts behind the Age of Fracture as Professor Rodgers scrutinizes it. One is the expanding presence of the market. Rodgers observes that, quote, more entrepreneurial university settings, end quote, encourage certain kinds of scholarship, and an ascendant entrepreneurial intensity could be felt in many areas of American life. A second shift involves the media. Postmodern theories captivated, quote, a generation that had grown up in the wake of the media revolution of the post-World War II era, in a sea of texts and meanings, amid a symbolic bombardment that was now part and parcel even of politics, end quote. The media revolution had its own links to an ascendant market and to the era's manifold technological transformations. Third, there was, quote, a growing heterogeneity of American society in the last quarter of the century, end quote. Multiculturalism was real, not just a word, and the nation ever less white, less Protestant, less stereotypically American. Fourth, globalization united the first 3 shifts. It extended the scope of the market, it increased the growing heterogeneity around the United States, and it impinged on the era's consciousness through a globalizing media landscape. Though Age of Fracture is not a transnational history, its argument is enmeshed in, quote, emerging patterns of global commerce and communication. In one causal statement, Rodgers asserts that, quote, globalizing markets had shortened time expectations, end quote. Elsewhere, he writes about globalizing entities, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the academic and government consultants who preach deregulation, as themselves the products of a disaggregated imagination, of a social vision that began and ended with microeconomics. My question here is whether Professor Rodgers sees a hierarchy of significance among these 5 factors: a widening market, a media revolution, ethnic and racial heterogeneity and globalization on the one hand, and the fractured social imagination on the other. So in sum, Age of Fracture shows the distance traveled from the socialism-tinged 1930s, as well as from the structuralist and institutionalist social science of the 1950s. And surprisingly, for a book on social thought, its subject is strangely in sync with the modernist literature so beloved by 30s intellectuals. In his concluding chapter, Wrinkles in Time, Rodgers charts, quote, the idea of penetrating time, folding history over upon itself, end quote. He has Francis Fukuyama and a bit later Donald Rumsfeld's planning for the Iraq War in mind. But how aptly this poetic phrase describes the canonical literature of modernism, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, or closer to home, John Dos Passos's USA trilogy, in which a camera eye roves anarchically over American history, bearing witness to fractures in the American soul. Literature, of course, takes us to another discussion, but not to another history. Amid the fractures, an intriguing continuity of fractures can be seen, and possibly this is a prehistory to the history illuminated in Professor Rodgers' wonderful book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for those very thoughtful responses to what is obviously a very provocative and thought-filled book. Dan, do you want to make a few responses before we open it up?
These are very, very generous and very important and very thoughtful comments. So I just mainly want to embrace most of them. I'm not sure, John, I totally agree with the cyclical theory of American history, and I'm not totally sure that the fundament is always individualism. When Emerson writes those essays on individualism, when he writes about finding the I in the self that he felt so constrained by in early 19th century Massachusetts, it was an act of rebellion against the culture, and certainly some of the 1960s folks who wanted to find new possibilities of the self thought of themselves as not merely, and I don't think this is what you said, speaking the default American code, but I think there's a struggle over and over again between forms of individualism and forms of collective consciousness, and maybe we're not in this country much different from others, except in the way they're balanced out. It's a very important caution that John made in the second part of his remark, is that by measuring the changes of the last quarter of the century against the social thought of the middle of the century, those period of great crisis, first the crisis of the Depression, then the crisis of the war, then the crisis of the Cold War, that I have set up a time when solidarity might have been almost inevitably produced by the dangers outside against a period when those pressures were somewhat relaxed. And it's true. And one needs to perhaps be a little cautious about the starting point there, except insofar as the progressive era, about which we have both done some work, in which notions of public goods, notions of the social good, notions of the state as an entity which is natural to society, these all came not out of a period of externally imposed crisis, not out of anything like the Cold War, but out of what we might call normal market commercial capitalist times. They didn't come from outside as much as they came from small groups and agents inside this. So that makes me more, I've sometimes been asked, well, will fracture ever end? And I think when there's the ending is not only to be expected by some meteor in the system that makes us all shiver and afraid. People who shiver and afraid can vote for a national socialism as quickly as they can vote for anything else. And so I'm not a fan necessarily of danger as producing the kind of politics you and I would like. But what John's most important point here is that a positive vision of the future outside of those individual economic ambitions that we have is very, very hard to find at this moment. And without that, things will not change. Michael's point, to the extent that I was thinking of literature, I was thinking of Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote this kid's book, Wrinkle in Time, that Gaither knows as well as I do. Some of you have read this to your children. About time travel rather than about modernism. But still, it's true that someone working to extend what I would hope to be the picture that I've drawn needs to do what I've not done in this book, which is to reach out toward the arts, toward popular culture, toward music, toward writing, and make a much broader picture than I have. Though I think we could recognize this exuberant play of fractures in at least the plastic arts of our own day. Reagan is a nationalist. Reagan was a nationalist, but one of the points I try to make in the first part of the book was his nationalism was less robust than we sometimes, and certainly in retrospect, have taken it to be. This Cold Warrior waged a very, very cautious kind of Cold War. He liked surrogates much better than he liked using the U.S. Marines. And in that sense, the lessons that his successors have taken from Reagan's actual practice have not been those he used. Contras, they were much more his favorite a source of the assertion of American power than actually landing a craft. And in a part of this that I found most fascinating, and maybe I overdo it, but I don't think so, and that is Reagan's innovations in his State of the Union addresses. When at the very end of the State of the Union addresses, as I try to describe at the end of the first chapter here, when most presidents, as Kennedy and his writers, would turn to some celebration or some statement of challenge to the nation at large, Reagan turned to individuals whom he'd invited into the Congress, and one by one they stood up. People who had done wonderful things. One by one they had done wonderful things. And one by one they stood up. And the president abdicated the role for the moment of president and became, as it were, the MC of a show about us. And one by one we took our applause for each other. That's an image of America that had never been portrayed in this venue in this way before. Would I like to rank my causes in order? No. I think that one must think of them as in interaction all against each other, and for naming them as he did and making sure they're in our consciousness, I think I must be particularly grateful.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, now it's your turn. Please raise your hand and wait for a mic and identify yourself, and try not to make your questions too long. We'll start with David Greenberg over here. Wait, David, wait for Mike.
David Greenberg, Rutgers University. I'm a fellow here this year. I enjoyed your talk, Dan, and the comments very much. Look forward to reading the book, which I haven't done yet. I want to see if I can tweak or push on two issues that might be related. One would be the starting date of the period and whether it really shouldn't properly be the late 60s that fracture begins. I mean, in a scheme of 40 years, maybe 5 isn't so big. Mm-hmm. The other is the importance of politics, which it sounds like perhaps your book treats more than the remarks. I take the point about the contrast with Sean's book, and I think I reviewed that book and challenged the age of Reagan because I thought he underestimated the sort of enduring power of liberalism and the Democratic Party in the 80s. But as for the presidency itself, John Judis' point about the decline of authority seems to me a very important theme, and that in the late 60s, culminating, say, with Watergate, you have Johnson basically forced not to run again. You have Nixon forced from office. You have the vice president forced from office for the first time, almost kind of unnoted in most histories now. So you wind up with a president and vice president, neither of whom are elected to anything. You have the talk of the impeachment of the Supreme Court Chief Justice, that there is a way in which the bonds of political authority are really coming under a pressure in the late 60s and early 70s that it seems to me they haven't before, at least in a very long time in American history, and that is in a way maybe not at the root exclusively, but is very central to this story of fracture in a way that perhaps you, at least so far, I haven't heard recognized, but maybe you would agree to. Anyway, that's my comment or question.
Periodization, as we all know, all the historians in the room, is it's not arbitrary. It's not in the least bit arbitrary. But you crack open the progression of years in any one place, and you see different patterns in it. And so I would never say that the age of fracture had to begin in 1973 instead of 1968, or that would even be a terribly meaningful question. But what one might say is, by looking, as many historians have done, at the 1960s as the beginning of the new, what I think of as the new constellation, I think we've overdone that. If there were key words that came out of 1960s social thought, at least up through, say, 1966 or 1967, we can't parse this too narrowly, the beloved community, the movement, the people, participational democracy, there was still a strong sense, that amidst all the marches in the street, some new collective and better America was going to emerge. By the time you get into the later part of this period, I think we're in a different language for all the continuities that you represent. You know, I don't know what to say about presidents. I understand they're very important, and I understand that they're very much more important now than they used to be, and this is what you're working on, David. But I think politics is largely made from the bottom up. I think the very last few years, and are looking at conservatism, as we iterated that once more, and that people can lose faith in a particular president without losing faith in the whole structured system. And so what I would think might be more important for our time is, in fact, the era of divided governance itself. When the houses of Congress essentially check and balance each other, when the president checks and balances one of the houses. But we may be close to what Madison wanted, though I actually doubt that very much. But we are in a realm where trying to map out a strong vision of the future is very difficult for any of the players in politics.
Stephen, yeah, right there.
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm tempted by your word fracture, which to me leads to my question of whether this fracture, and the word may be your editor's and not your own.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Is this fracture simple, compound, or complex? And the word implies a painful wound that logically should be healed. And I'm not clear if that is also what your own meaning, and if so, what would the healing process be like?
Well, it is my word, and I hadn't thought about it in medical terms as much as you have, and I should. I had thought more about the ways in which an entity, a solid, inanimate entity, fragments, fractures. My working title had been The Age of Disaggregation, but there was no way but I was going to understand that. So I thought I was making progress here. There are wounds always. And any one of these moments when a particular way of looking at the world too strongly comes into the fore leaves wounds. It leaves people out. It leaves possibilities out. And so I don't want to reject the medical analogy. And I think in some ways it's a pretty terrible a fracture, which has left shards of bone and blood all over. And here I have to give the historian's cop out, but I don't. Which is, we will not, by waving some idea over our heads of post-1945 social thought, and by trying to go back there, we'll never find our way back to anything like that. It comes from a particular context. It comes out of ways of thinking that we can't have. And so what I hope to do here is, by telling these stories, some of which are stories, some of which may be stories of smash-ups, some are stories of dissipation. There are many different kinds of stories. If we can trace our way back to how we got to the language we take for granted now, maybe we might have the resources to invent something newer for the next age.
Thanks, Dave. May, right here. Yeah.
Hi, May Nye. Hi, Dan.
I may.
I just have a really quick comment about national service, and then I have a question. I think nowadays many high schools require their students to have a certain number of hours of community service. And I think what's interesting about that is that it's not in the spirit of national service. It's a kind of 1,000 points of light charitable work that now individuals do in lieu of society taking care of people who have needs. So I think it's interesting that the idea of service is actually quite alive among young people on college campuses and high schools, but it's not what you're talking about. My question, Dan, I want to push you a little more on this causality question. I appreciate fully that there's no single cause for any historical change. But it seems to me in placing your period not at 68 but at 74, you're giving some primacy to the economic situation. That, I think, is the end of the New Deal era. It's the end of a very long period of increasing or decreasing income inequality, right? Did I get that right? So I want to ask you a little more about the place you put on that, because given that there's no single cause for anything, I think your periodization suggests a certain economic push to this.
Right. No, I do think that the fundament of change here, not that there weren't other possibilities on the card, but the fundament of change is economic, and it does come out of that economic crisis, and it comes in particular out of the way in which economists thought themselves out of that economic crisis. That's the chapter on what I call the revival of the idea of the market comes first in the book, and I mean that as a statement of cause, partly because the new understanding of the human self, that desire, possessing, choice-making, self-acting, sometimes making acts of altruism, but reaping the kind of reward that a good person gets from feeling good about the work one does, that image of the human nature is the one that the economists taught us. It doesn't begin. You can go way back in economics, but it had a revival in this period. I think the economists also convinced most people that that markets had a self-recovery possibility that economists from 1945 to 1973 didn't believe before, and they need to be lightly managed, and that helped to create the division between a sense of the economy and the state, which Paul Samuelson, writing about the mixed economy, just didn't understand as true at all. So you're not wrong to think that I've got more than a closet set of economic contexts, if not very strong economic causes in the argument.
Okay, let's go over to this side, in the back. Yeah.
Tom Friedman. Whenever I see something as a reporter that I've just never seen before, I really want to roll it over. And I've never seen before a session of Congress begin, maybe I've missed this, with members of both parties dividing up the Constitution and reading the different segments and amendments. What did you make of that?
I made two things of it. One is I was actually, at the end I was glad. I thought, in fact, if one party had successfully convinced itself and the other party had convinced itself that the Constitution only belonged to some of the American people, then we were really going to be in trouble. And so the ways in which, after the initiation on the right, Congress folks in the Democratic Party took pride in reading a part of the Constitution that they took pride in. It's a mixed document. Who would want to read, who would want to necessarily read the parts you were assigned? But there were reports of congresspersons who had been able to get up there and speak a piece of the First Amendment and feel really engaged with it. So I thought, in the end, it was in fact somewhat inspiring, though the fights will all now take place. But the last chapter, the one that I facetiously entitled Wrinkles in Time, is about a number of things. It's about originalism in Supreme Court jurisprudence. It's about the notion of trying to shock the post-communist economies into capitalism overnight. It's about foreshortening time, which is way economists tend to think about markets. You don't need a lot of friction in their models, and they don't have much friction. And so the sad thing about the reading of the Constitution is that to the extent that those who engaged in it for all kinds of reasons imagined that we could just get it right, we could solve our problems by just reaching back into 1787. That's a denial of history, as we all know, and that's that's an illusion. And I hope we will understand it as a kind of pious act which carries this danger of imagining that we can, in fact, escape from our time.
Yeah, right over here. Frank, I think Frank, yeah.
Hey, I'm Frank Four, and I come from the world of media, which would seem on its surface to be the perfect object lesson of the type of fragmentation that you're describing, where you have these grand unifying institutions, these newspapers, these network news channels, which have dissipated and dissolved into a whole new ideology of blogging and Twitter and Facebook, which seem to be the same sort of individualistic activities and ethos that you're describing. But behind the dissolution of the old institutions and the rise of this new ideology, you do have new institutions and new powers rising in its place. So you have Google, which is the ultimate disaggregating institution, but is in itself aggregating in and of itself extremely powerful and has an enormous amount of control. Same is true with Facebook and the like. So does that count as an object lesson at all in the ways in which fracture may itself be illusory, and that in its place we have all sorts of new power, authority rising? I could think of the same is true with government itself, that government is clearly under assault, and the sort of fragmentation that you're describing is happening, yet the powers of government in certain ways continue to be expanding with the surveillance state and the like.
Right. Well, I'll only add one small caveat, because what you say is right. There are new institutions rising around us, and they are very strong, and they're very, very powerful. Anyone looking at the history of capitalism would say the same sort of thing. The entrepreneurs are everywhere, but they're not institutionless. It is our inability to find a powerful language, a resonant language to talk about these kinds of things, that I think is remarkable for our time. And so almost no one thinks of Google in the way they thought of AT&T in the 1960s. And that's the only thing I would add, what you said.
Yeah. Here, flip. Yeah.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. I want to follow up on Frank's question and your answer, and I want to hit this one as much to John as to the other people on the panel. The opposite of fragmentation, obviously, is solidification. And it seems to me that in looking at the fragmentation, we can see the solidification of much smaller groups and much smaller entities and much smaller institutions. And John, thank you for putting this in the context of American history and precisely periods of fragmentation and solidification. And I'm just wondering, do you, as you look at American history, see reasons for the solidification that follows periods of fragmentation other than outside threats? And might that give us some kind of insight into what might or might not happen in the years immediately ahead?
No.
That's for you, John, I think.
I'll just say very briefly, I think that I mentioned briefly the progressive era in American history from the 1890s to at least to the First World War, if not, as some of us think, longer. What you see there is a series of connected but independent initiatives, social initiatives, whether it's Jane Addams working at Hull House, whether it's the first persons advocating for factory inspectorship to make sure that children under age 12 or under age 14 are not working in cotton mills, whether it's people interested in using state inspection powers to make sure that the milk is not being watered so that children will die. None of them thought of themselves at the beginning as engaged in a movement. But they found vocabularies in common, they found allies in common, and the world changed because of that. I think one can see this in other countries besides the United States. And so when I'm asked, what major national change will alter the state of affairs, my own feeling is that none will. But a new civic activism might. Best I could do.
Let me say one comment about the progressive era. One thing you did have, you had a kind of internal threat from the 1880s through World War I called the class war, and that's how many of the progressives and liberal elites understood their task was trying to heal the society, to heal that particular fracture. So there was a basis for what Theodore Roosevelt called the new nationalism, but again, it was disputed at the time. I mean, it wasn't as if that was accepted by everybody. The way that nationalism, when I was growing up in the 50s, was simply everybody went to the Memorial Day parade. I think again that was an era of more that was not unambiguous as far as the nationalism, individualism, but to the extent there was that kind of solidarity, it came from trying to overcome this war within. So that's my, and I worry about that we don't have a basis for overcoming the kind of fractures that Dan talks about without a kind of internal, an internal basis or an external basis that. Like those. So
this is simply, we'll make the point quickly, but simply the way I read the book in context, the globalization is not one of its explicit themes, but sort of everywhere on the margins of the book, and I couldn't help but wondering if all of the energy being devoted to globalization in these decades wasn't sucking energy from the social and from the national within the United States, that there's almost a kind of transnational relationship that to the extent that globalization is flourishing, these other principles flourish less.
Well, I mean, let me try a slightly more optimistic statement, though. As I say, riding in a car with an historian is like driving with somebody who's fixated on the rearview mirror. They're going to crash into something, and it won't take them long. But because we don't know where we're going, we just know what's behind. But there are all kinds of things happening right at this very moment. There are folks who are coming out of the individualized social service crusades. They're folks coming from conservative churches into Africa to give medical aid. There are people rallying around Cuban refugees. There are also many on the religious right, are associated with it theologically, who recognize the importance of state power, recognize the importance of, in fact, a state, voluntary, and individual action all working together. That's true in the labor movement. That is true in many forms of civic activism. There's a lot that's inchoate that's almost there. What we're inhibited by is in part the hall of mirrors of the media, a certain polarization that we all live with now, but I think that's got to pass sooner or later. We're inhibited, I think, by our ability to well, this would be the point that Robert Bellah made in Habits of the Heart. Do you remember the chapter in which he interviews people who are doing extraordinary things for the public good? And he says, why do you do that? Why do you spend these hours on the zoning board? Why do you spend these hours? And they say, it makes me feel good. And Bellah wants them to say something else in addition to that. And we merely need to find that other language and cultivate that other language because we think it does some good in the world. Because we think people are interconnected, because we think that the institutions of governance and the institutions of voluntary activity are part of what we do in common.
Alan, yeah.
Alan Crowd. I teach history at American University. It's a two-part question. One concerns the concept of fracture and how we study the past. And I'm wondering, to an extent, is not the consciousness of fracture in part a result of the balkanization of the historical profession, of the way we look at the past, of how journalists and historians are trained, and that, in a sense, it has to do with the lens through which we're looking at the past. So that's part one. We're very sensitive to fracture. The part two of the question concerns whether or not fracture is necessarily a bad thing. For example, if one thinks of the emphasis upon conformity and assimilation of immigrants and the kind of forcing people into a mold of the 1950s, and one thinks of the respect for a multi-ethnic society and the multiculturalism of the contemporary period, is that a bad thing, or is that perhaps a kind of benevolent fracture?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good thing. It's a very good thing, and it's a thing we must move forward from. That's that way. What comes in the future is going to be very different from anything that's happened in the past. No, I do not want, as I said, to write this book or to leave the readers of this book with a sense that it's a plea for nostalgia or that it should promote a plea for nostalgia. When the language of the social can be too robust, it can be too strong, it can cage the persons inside it, and it can be too weak at the same time.
Okay, did you have a question? Yeah, this is going to be the last question. And we'll continue the conversation outside.
Hi, Jennifer Burns, University of Virginia. I finished reading your book literally 48 hours ago, and I want to say for those who haven't read it, it's very lucid, very informative, and also beautifully written. So I really appreciate it. My question is, looking at, and this is a very intellectual history question, I apologize. Reading the book, it really struck me that much of what you call fracture could also fly under the flag of postmodernism or of neoliberalism. And you, to some degree, engage postmodernism, not so much the term neoliberalism. And this is a bit of a selfish question because I'm wrestling with this term. What does it mean? How do we use it? And why specifically don't American historians use it when it seems to have taken the rest of the academy by storm? So I wonder if you could just maybe address a little bit to what extent was it a deliberate sidestepping of these two theoretical terms? To what extent was it not? And I'm just sort of selfishly interested in anything you'd have to contribute on these topics. So thank you.
Jennifer Burns has written a wonderful book you should all read on Ayn Rand. And so she actually knows how to make the words work on a page and how to make ideas strong and powerful. So I take this as a question by somebody who already knows the game to play and the game we must play. But it seems to me that when we catch our own attention and when we catch the attention of readers, we have to be very careful not to find our way into words that the readers already think they know. Then you simply amplify what's already going on in their heads. And yet we don't want to take them by some set of neologisms that simply don't make any sense to them. And so in all the work that I've done, I must say I've struggled to try to find language. I can find computer files in which all the words that I will not use, because I just think they're dead, they're tired, they're coercive, they're not doing what I need to do. And hope that in this project, in fact, by shifting the vocabulary somewhat out of the usual and expected tracks, I may provoke some others better than I to think in new terms.
Well, we want to thank our panelists very much. Thank you, Dan, for giving us this wonderful book, and Michael and John for your comments, and the audience for your questions. We can continue the conversation outside over wine and cheese. The book is available for sale, and I'm sure Dan will be happy to sign them. Thank you all for coming.